Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the broadcast. Tonight's webinar on June 15, 2017 is about various approaches to treating addiction and substance abuse. And one of the points that I'm going to make several times throughout the webinar this evening is the idea that in many cases it's the same approach, whether you're dealing with an addict or you're dealing with somebody who just has a problem in their relationships with chemicals or with another addictive activity or substance. And in some ways, you're using the same kind of approach with people that aren't necessarily addicts, people that are struggling with other behaviors, other symptoms in the process. And so I think there's wisdom in seeing the similarities and the overlap and the wisdom of each model and what it offers us. I say often that the healthier we get, the more we see similarities between ourselves and other people. Even if somebody has a dramatically different presentation or a diagnosis, we start to see the similarities. And I think the same is true with therapy models, that the more evolved we become as therapists and as clients, the more we're able to see the wisdom, the value of various approaches. So with that, let's get into the content. Let's talk about the definition of addiction. So from the diagnostic manual, we talk about it in terms of tolerance. Does it require more of the substance for you to experience the high? That's one of the features, measuring that. Will you experience withdrawal if the substance is taken away from you? And some of those withdrawals are obvious. Some of them are actually life-threatening, as in alcohol and benzodiazepines. Some of them are just very uncomfortable physically. But some of them are also emotional. I often talked about kind of an emotional withdrawal that a lot of our clients go through when they're removed from substances that might not be as physically addictive, like marijuana or more casual use. And it came out in agitation, in loneliness and despair, and desperately wanting to get back to what was comfortable and what was familiar to them. Missing home looked like emotional withdrawal at home because their home life was not necessarily any kind of respite for them, any kind of comfort for them. So they were longing for that comfort. Parents will talk about this in terms of when my child is using is when they're in a good mood and when they're more patient. It's actually, and the young people will say this to their parents, it's when they're not using that they'll become more irritable. So it can look like that. And the more, of course, severe and life-threatening it is, the more significant it is. Using larger amounts for longer periods of time than intended, there's a lack of conscious control of it. We talk about in therapy, and we talk about with addiction often, kind of what people are doing it for, what's underneath it. And that's really something I think we overstate because it's not necessarily conscious. That might be the initial driver or the initial pull or energy that gets somebody into a certain kind of behavior. But after a while, it becomes a habit, it becomes unconscious. And so when a therapist describes you, that's really what they're describing is the unconscious process under that. Because on a conscious level, there's not a lot of intention and choice about it. Right? It's just a habit like all of us. And it takes a great deal of focus, a great deal of capacity and growth in the various models we'll talk about today. They would talk about that in different ways, but it takes a lot of energy and capacity to stop doing that. Persistent desire, unsuccessful efforts to cut down on use. I have a lot of stories. Some are funny. One of my colleagues said, who's in long-term recovery, he said, if he came to the conclusion or found out today that he was not an alcoholic, the very first thing he would do is go and have a drink. I remember I had a student years ago who told me this story, that during one period of time, he decided, I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to drink to prove that I can go without it. So he was hanging out with friends on a weekend night, and after several hours, he hadn't drank anything. And so he said, I proved myself. Now I'm going to go get a drink. And he bought himself a 40-ounce beer. So there's a lot of self-deception. There's a lot of justification. And there's a lot of rationalizing that comes as a part of this particular bullet point. Time is spent obtaining alcohol or drugs and recovering from the effect. So there's a significant, it becomes a ritual. People involved in intravenous drug use, for example, talk about the ritual of it. Marijuana addicts will talk about the ritual. They think about pipes and bongs and joints and rolling. They're reading and they're thinking about it constantly. It becomes all of their activity. Social, occupational, and recreational pursuits are given up. or reduced because of use, drug or alcohol use. So we see that a lot. Parents will talk about he or she doesn't enjoy the same kind of sports, doesn't want to spend time with family. So those things get replaced. And use is continued despite a knowledge of the drug and alcohol related harm, physical or psychological, in various spheres of life, your health, your social relationships, your family relationships, the effects on your legal standing if you get arrested or not, right? Your participation or what your performance at work or school is like. So all those various areas. In terms of 12-step programs, and I'm going to focus on a couple of models tonight more than others. In terms of 12-step model, really the only diagnosis is self-diagnosis. The 12-step model would say it doesn't matter if I can legally diagnose you as an alcoholic or an addict, which I can according to the state of Utah. Right? I have that authority, that expertise. I'm licensed to do that. But really, it's if you think you got a problem and if you can see it. And I'm going to talk today about ways to approach our loved ones to be helpful in that process instead of a hindrance in that process. And many of our instincts become hindrances. One of which is to try to force somebody who has an apparent substance abuse problem, try to force them to accept the diagnosis. Right? That kind of energy tends to provoke a defensiveness. A couple of quotes. A teen to have either used nicotine or marijuana by the age of 13, 68% will develop a drug and alcohol dependency later in life. 40% of those who started drinking at 13 or younger developed alcohol dependency later in life. Compare this with 10% of those who began drinking after the age of 17. And then, of course, there's a direct correlation between the time of critical incident and the intervention and success. That's simple behavior, right? The closer in time the response, the reward or the punishment, the aversive or the intervention, the more likely it is to have a positive effect or to make some kind of effect. Children are not little adults. I think that's something that we need to teach and remind ourselves of constantly, because I think a lot of people think of them as young adults. They have different brains, they're a different animal, so to speak. And so to apply our reasoning to them doesn't work. And this follows into drug and alcohol use. Alcohol affects the teen brain differently than affects the mature adult brain. The brain goes through rapid development, wiring changes between the ages of 12 and 25. Right? There's pruning going on. Parts of the brain that aren't getting used fall away. Pathways fall away, die. Pathways that are being constantly traveled become solidified. And then when we reach adulthood, that window closes. It's not completely closed, but it's more difficult to treat. And so alcohol or drugs act like a virus in the brain, slowing and shutting down brain activity, deleting or distorting neural messages, damaging neural connections, hindering formation of brain wiring, rewiring the brain's pleasure reward system, which can lead to the alcohol dependency and addiction, right? There are natural ways that our system comforts us. There's dopamine. And alcohol and other drugs increase that dopamine. It gives you that sense of pleasure. If you do it between the age of 12 and 25, you significantly rewire the brain for addiction. And the interesting thing about adolescence, about young people, and the adolescent brain, which is the brain until about the age of 25, the interesting thing about it is that their pleasure center requires more stimulation. An adult pleasure center, we don't require as much thrill seeking in general because of our brains. We can get a lot of pleasure out of quiet afternoon reading a book on the back patio, whereas an adolescent brain requires a lot more stimulation. So that they're prone to, predisposed to, not ready for, they're vulnerable to addiction with the introduction of drug and alcohol at that age range. It's not black and white, it's not hopeful, but it's something to be aware of. It suggests, I think for parents who struggle and talk about everybody's doing it, it suggests an increased level of vigilance, of awareness, to intervene, to do something about it and not normalize it. Let's talk about the different stages of abuse or use. Early stage, experimentation and entry. Begin smoking cigarettes, begin smoking pot and drinking, may steal medications from parents. School problems begin. Maybe truancies or begging parents to make excuses for them. May not come home as requested, excuse me. May not come home when requested, staying out all night. Few consequences from their use. They have an ability to control use in the early stages. The choice is more conscious and intentional. The tolerance starts to build up. Substances often become a way of connecting to other people. It's done socially. Fitting in is the goal, right? You have these kind of intentions that we talk about. Attention span decreases. They require more stimulation. Lower the tolerance of frustration. Peer group problems begin to emerge. That's early stages. The middle stage. Make some attempts to limit their use. Start to recognize that there's a problem. They blame people in this stage for things that are going wrong, right? It's the police who pulled me over. It's my parents' fault. I think this is where maybe a large majority of the parents and children that come to evoke are at. They start to experiment with other drugs. We do know that there is such a thing as gateway drugs that decrease an individual's sensitivity or open them up to other possibilities, other drug use, using instead of or during important activities, school, job, work, driving, so forth. Withdrawing from family and friends, changing peer groups. Again, that's a lot of what I think is one of the alarm bells that goes off for parents. Stealing in line becomes more common. It's hard to maintain academics the more that this increases. So there's a decline in more truancy. Mood swings, increase of time and spent in using substances. The preoccupation is increasing. When I was a teenager, and I was in my use period, that's all we talked about. That's all we did. It was everything of the day was surrounded about the next time that we're going to smoke pot. Arguments with family, legal difficulty, and tolerance, of course, is increasing. After a while, the individual experiences being high as normal and being not high as the abnormal. And then, of course, late stage, what we would call dependency. Suspension or being expelled from school, increase in legal issues, increase in anxiety, lowered self-esteem, blackouts, passing out, signs of withdrawal, if there's an abstinent period, isolating, using alone to cope, just to feel normal, like I described, anger outbursts, often when not using, denial of using stops trying to hide the use, it's blatant, binging or daily use, stealing, dealing, or prostitution to support the habit, weight gain or weight loss, high tolerance and or withdrawal. In our young adults, we see this much, much more, but we still see it with adolescents, and then identify with the culture and the rituals. So that's the point that I'm making. What's the difference between treating somebody in the early stage and the late stage? And in many cases, it's the exact same thing. There's almost no difference. I think about that. I get brought into families often to try to be a preventative therapist. Can you help us so we don't need to take a more immersive step? And what I say to families is, I'm going to ask you to do some things, ask you to do some work. And it would be the same work that you'd be asked to do if your child ends up in treatment or post-treatment. So it doesn't change much. And that really helps me. So when a child says, I don't need this, my response is, this is for everybody. And I don't need to get into an argument or a debate or a power struggle around what stage of use are you at, which parents get very, I think, inadvertently, not intentionally, but they get involved in that power struggle, and then you get stuck on that. It's irrelevant. Individuals who begin using drugs as juveniles are at greater risk of becoming addicted compared to those who begin use as an adult due to the immaturity of the teenage brain, particularly the part of the brain that controls impulses. So that's why we're more sensitive to adolescent. And I'm using adolescent in terms of the adolescent brain, 12 to 25. That's why we're more sensitive, careful, interested when somebody starts using. I remember I was listening to a panel discussion one time with some professionals that ran several treatment programs at the National Association of Addiction Treatment Professionals. And the panel question was, if somebody brought in their young adult and who clearly showed signs of addictions, and the parent asked you, how are you going to convince my child that they're an addict? They're in denial. What would you do? And there were various answers. And the answer I gave was, I wouldn't try to convince them. That's not my job. My job is to provide enough therapy so that they can figure out if they are, so that they can become aware of the right questions to ask. And that has to be a gentle, respectful approach, not a kind of punch them in the nose kind of approach. That might work for some people, but for many addicts and alcoholics, that kind of bashing in their defenses through a use of force or debate or proof doesn't tend to work. So when a client tells me that he or she is not an addict, my response is, okay, this is the best kind of therapy that I know, even the 12 steps, to ensure, to support, to make it possible for you not to become one. If you follow these principles in your daily lives, the core principles of it, you stand your best chance of it not becoming a problem. And if it does become a problem, then you'll know what to do. So I'm going to talk about the 12 steps. It's important to understand that the 12 steps are a model that we use in therapy, right? Programs, healthy, effective programs have 12 steps as a part of it often, but that's not all they have as a part of it. They also have therapy, experiential activities, training, other activities. So it's not just the 12 steps, although for many addicts, the 12 steps are essential for their survival. I will say that as clearly as possible. I see debates in newspapers, in the news media, about people attacking the 12 steps. And my answer at the end of the day, for some people, it's the only thing that they've found that keeps them alive. And why would I want to fight against that? Just to be right, just to prove something. So step number one, we admitted that we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Most people, when they hear these statements, these first few steps about surrender, it's not about that you don't have a choice. People that are in recovery are incredibly courageous, active, assertive. They're empowered, but this is a kind of humility. It's saying, I can't go and hang out at a bar every night. I can't have one drink. That's not the way that I work. If I have one drink, I'll have 10 drinks. If I hang out with addicts and alcoholics, I'm going to be in trouble. Active alcoholics and addicts. If I go to bars, I'm going to be in trouble. I know myself well enough. And I think we can all relate to that. I have a similar relationship with sweets. I rarely, almost never eat sweets. And people say, because you don't like them? I said, no, I love sweets. In mine, I would rather just eat them all the time. But I know I don't tend to just have one bite of a piece of cake or a piece of pie. So I don't eat them, and I'm okay with that. It feels comfortable and healthy for me. So this idea of surrender is not about a lack of responsibility. It's about a humility. It's about self-awareness. It's about not overestimating your strength, not underestimating the challenge and the predisposition that you have, your own personality. And we can all relate to that. There's a higher power in this. Steps 2 are come to believe that a higher power can restore us to sanity, turn our lives over to this higher power. Again, this isn't about doing nothing. This is about saying, it really is the same as radical acceptance and saying, I know I'll be okay. And I can show up, I can tell the truth, I can work my program, I can make my amends, I can do all of that, and it'll be okay. And when something bad happens to me, I can make meaning out of it. That's all that this means. It's the same philosophy as existentialism, as logotherapy from Viktor Frankl. It's saying that this context, this idea that there's something out there bigger than me that knows more than I do. And so what that does is I don't become God, right? I don't try to control everything. How many of us can relate to that as parents about trying to control outcomes all the way? So I think the biggest shift in the first 3 steps is accepting that we're not God, that we're not in charge of managing everything and protecting everybody. We're just in charge of showing up, being honest, authentic, kind, compassionate, loving, curious, all of that. And doing that in all of our relationships to the best of our ability, and trusting that it'll be okay. And then steps 4, 5, 6, 7 are a big deal. It's admitting that we have problems, that we've made mistakes to ourselves and one other person. Step 4 is making a searching and fearless moral inventory. How many of us could benefit from that, doing this work, of unburdening ourselves of this shame and confessing that to ourselves, to our higher power, to at least one other person? Step number 5 is admit it to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrong. That's essentially what therapy is. It's going in and talking about, like Viktor Frankl says, it's not going in and hearing difficult things, it's going in and saying difficult things. And then being willing to let these things go. In this language, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects. Humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. Made a list of all the persons we have harmed is number 8, and became willing to make amends to them all. And number 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except for to do so would injure them or others. That's a big piece of the work. I know a lot of people in recovery that when they're doing their 9th step and they lose focus, their sponsor tells them, focus on your 9th step. And people that are committed to their recovery, they're sincere about it. They pay people back. I've told the story about clients I work with who, a good portion of their paycheck is going toward their amends list. And it's a constant work for them. And then step number 10, we do this on a daily basis. We take a personal inventory, and when we were wrong, we promptly admitted it. How great would it be if every parent was doing that? Every person was doing that. Right? These things aren't just about substance use or abuse. It's about living a life free of shame, free of ego, right? Getting rid of the things that get in the way of our mental health. And then step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with our higher power, with God as we understood him, praying only for his knowledge of his will and our power to carry that out. Again, a humility. It's finding your highest self. I know the God concept is a barrier for a lot of people. It doesn't have to be. I know a lot of atheists who are great with AA and NA, and their higher power becomes the group. Their higher power becomes the program, the universe, right? It's a basic trust in life that it will be okay. And then the service piece, number 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. I think for a lot of people, this is what keeps them sober. This is what their maintenance is about. They have sponsees, they have passion projects, they work in recovery, they do some of it for free. That's the 12th step. They talk about at a meeting, cleaning the dishes, cleaning the coffee cups, just being of service to other people. And for a lot of them, that's what gives them meaning in their life, because they've been so self-absorbed, so disconnected from community, from others. So I think the principles are learning to let go of control and transcending what happens to us. That's that higher power perspective. Looking at a day at a time. I'll talk later on about some of the criticisms of this, but in a lot of ways, this is what we all do. I had a client years ago. It was actually my first female client in wilderness therapy, over 20 years ago. And she was doing some incredibly difficult work around abuse. And I said to her, how are you doing it? And she said, how do you do it? She didn't know what was going on in my life, but I was going through some challenges. And then I realized for the first time, I knew what one day at a time meant. I knew that I just make it through the day. I can't swallow a pill for the rest of my life. My analogy is, if I laid a vitamin out in front of you that gave you all the nutrients for the rest of your life, you would die and choke on it. So you do it one day at a time. You work on the now. It's a very Buddhist idea of the only real presence, the only thing that's true is the present moment. And we can survive that. We can feel, we can lean into it. We can be there. But when we start to try to think of, okay, I got to be sober for the rest of my life. I can never drink again. I'm going to have to deal with parties. I'm going to have to deal with family. I'm going to have to deal with my family's going on a trip to Italy and there's going to be one. When we start to think that way, we get overwhelmed and we want to quit. So it's a mindset of the here and now. Surrender and humility, I talked about that. Vigilance. Saying I'm an addict and in recovery is just about being vigilant. It's saying that I have a problem with relationship to sweets or that I'm a diabetic. or that I've had skin cancer. And so I need to be careful about going out in the sun. It's not self-defeating or self-punishing or limiting. People that are in recovery will talk about being grateful for the disease and all that it's given them. Their friends, their life, their spirituality, everything. And so I think people apply their kind of filter to some of these steps and they misunderstand what's going on. It replaces old rituals with new rituals, meetings, attendance. It's all very structured, very similar. You can go to a meeting for free virtually anywhere in the world. That's a big deal. There's not a lot in self-help that is free, not a lot in therapy that is free. Group support and community. You walk into a 12-step meeting, you tell your story, you talk about the things you've done, the things that you do, the mistakes you make, and people say, you're welcome here, you're in the right place, thanks for coming. That is the ultimate in grace. And where there is grace, shame cannot exist, it cannot survive. So group support and community, they call each other, they call their sponsor, they call when they're feeling lonely, when they're triggered, right? It goes back and forth because that other person on the phone is offering service. Getting rid of shame through the disclosure of secrets. And then really when we understand the disease of alcoholism, when we think about it as a disease, it really causes us to provide treatment without judgment, right? That's a huge piece of the benefit of this model. And like I said, for many, it's the only thing that they attribute to them staying alive. I'm going to talk about the 7 challenges. I think the first thing I'll say is that the 7 challenges oftentimes are presented as an alternative to the 12 steps. I don't believe that. I believe any good 12-step program, any good therapist will adhere to the 7 challenges if they're doing a good job. So that can be a misunderstanding when programs market themselves and say, we need to use the 7 challenges. My question would be, okay, I'm glad. That's basically good therapy. Now, do you also provide opportunities for 12-step meetings, for 12-step work? Because they're not exclusive of each other, not even a little bit. We decided to open up and talk honestly about ourselves and about alcohol and other drugs. Step number 1. We looked at what we liked about alcohol and other drugs and why we were using them. We looked at our use of alcohol and other drugs to see if it had caused harm or could cause harm. We looked at our responsibility and the responsibility of others for our problems. We thought about where we seemed to be headed, where we wanted to go, and what we wanted to accomplish. We made thoughtful decisions about our lives and about our use of alcohol and other drugs. And lastly, we followed through on our decisions about our lives and drug use. If we saw problems, we went back to earlier challenges and mastered them. And all you're doing as a therapist is meeting them where they're at. And if they're at number 1, you don't go to number 7. Sometimes people, in their own compulsions, will try to jam number 7 down somebody's throat, that we decided that you need to make the decision. If you're not there, we're going to try to have a discussion about alcohol or where you're going or how it's going. And then there's no argument, there's no power struggle about being an addict. And this is evidence-based. I'm going to talk about motivational interviewing in just a moment. This is how it works. It's not intuitive because our intuition encourages us to try to control it, to try to manage it, to have to be top down and powerful. But this is how it works. And this model asks us to meet them where they're at. Dr. Schwebel came out and we hired him to come out and do a clinical meeting with all of our therapists many years ago. And he sat down and he explained this. One of my therapists turned to me and said, gosh, I wish I could take common sense and package it and sell it to people. And it was just common sense. And at one point, Dr. Schwebel asked us, we were going to lunch and we were late. They were serving us lunch. And so he said, I want to do a role play before lunch. And he presented as a client, as a resistant client. And one of our therapists just met him where he was at and said, I'm not trying to talk you into it. Tell me more, what you're thinking. And over again, Schwebel tried to get the therapist to buy into the power struggle, to become the enemy, to become the antagonist. And the therapist didn't buy it. And Dr. Schwebel stopped. After a few minutes, he said, that's the first time in all of my training that on the first role play, the therapist got it right. The first time I've ever seen it. And all of our therapists were thinking, well, this is what we do. I remember I had a visitor last year come out to the program, and there was a young man who was talking about how he was going to go home and use. He was going to control his use. And this professional was immersed in the 12-step culture, and they came out and they said, why didn't somebody confront him? And I said, what would that have done right there? And don't you imagine that he's had that discussion with his therapist and the staff? He's been in our program for 7 weeks. So we can intimidate him, argue with him, and get him to say the right thing, or we could get out of that power struggle and find out where he's really at, and that's where he's really at. When addicts tell me I'm never going to use again after the program, I don't believe them. When users tell me I'm going to use when I get out of here, I'm going to use when I get out of here, I don't believe that either. I don't know what you're going to do. It doesn't even matter to me, your promises. So this model, this energy, asks the clinician, the treatment professional, to meet them where they're at, to go back to earlier stages if they're not there yet, and to try to facilitate and have that discussion. Very, very similar. And I did a full webinar on motivational interviewing recently. Very, very similar to motivational interviewing, where they talk about the confrontation is not yelling or anger or self-centered, look what you're doing to me. It has to come from a place of love and being client-centered to be trustworthy. You know, the challenge is you take care of yourself through confrontation when your boundaries are being violated, not to get somebody else to change, right? So I think confrontation, again, is overused. And I think the difficulty in the treatment field, because there's so much countertransference, so much energy on try to fix the problem, try to fix the individual, that we could inadvertently become employed in the task of getting the person to say the right thing. And we don't want them to do that. We don't want them to be compliant, leave the program, and revert back right back to where they were because it wasn't internalized. Being aware of countertransference and transference, I think that's an important thing with motivational interviewing, because you want to evoke. They actually use the word evoke. You want to evoke out of the person their truth, their wisdom, their resources. You don't want to impose it on them. You don't want to compel them to say the right thing. Reflection of me error is, I think, what a lot of parents, what a lot of therapists struggle with is, I need to be a good parent, I need to be a good therapist. So for that, in the service of that, then you doing well or not is a reflection of me. It's really objectification. It's really absolutely horrible attachment. But we all have a little bit of that in us. We all fall into that. That's the beauty of the work that I talk about, is you don't have to be perfect. I had a client say to me that they didn't know something, that they were struggling with something about themselves. And I said, great, that's the goal. Because if you're closed off, or you're resistant, or you're unaware, or you're narcissistic, you won't even see the problem. And if you can show up as your own student, your own project with your child, you're so much safer to them. In motivational interviewing, confrontation is merely pointing out inconsistencies, talking about faulty reasoning, pros and cons, and acknowledging their perspective, honoring the defense. And again, since this book has been written many, many years ago, decades ago, they've done research on the principles of motivational interviewing, and they found over and over again that this is the most effective model for treatment. I tell this story that one of my first supervisors, we would take videotapes of closed circuit in our sessions. We would videotape the session so that we could have supervision. It was part of being at a university, and the therapy was very inexpensive. And I remember the first supervision session with my supervisor, he would pause the tape. It was videotape back then. And he would ask me, why did you say that? Why did you do that? And I answered the question. I was nervous because I thought I'd done something wrong. And then I answered to the best of my ability what my intention was, and he said, okay. And he pressed play. Pause it a moment later, did it again. And I was confused and thought, because most of the time when people say to me in my life, why did you do that? They mean you did the wrong thing. But I did my best to answer the question, and then he pressed play again. And after a while, I realized that's what he was teaching me. Why are you doing what you're doing? What's going on inside of you? Are you aware of that? And so I think a lot of times people that are treating addicts, I think they dismiss their own responsibility and approach. And motivational interviewing doesn't allow for that, right? We can't simply pin the lack of progress on clients because the disease is so difficult. We can ask ourselves, in addition to that, and recognize that, we can ask ourselves, where is the model or where am I falling short? That is okay. And if we feel well enough about ourselves, we'll be willing to ask and answer those kinds of questions. So motivational interviewing talks a lot about what's going on inside. We don't argue, prove, debate, or justify our parenting decisions. This is motivational interviewing, informed parenting. We take a we'll see approach. When a child promises something or apologizes for something, we just take a we'll see approach. Okay? We become very unattached to those kinds of things, to apologies and promises. We don't overpraise. We don't try to control how they feel, manage how they feel. We become much more reflective, much more observational, much more curious. We avoid phrases like, I'm proud of you, because it loads so much about you. We don't get too high when it's going well, and we don't get too low. We don't hang on too tight. And in a lot of ways, for some parents, they have to ignore some of the information with their young adult children, right? They have to take a step back. And I'm going to say this, in this way of thinking, it goes along with the 12 steps also and the 7 challenges. Your child's recovery as an adult is none of your responsibility, none of your business. Your focus is yours, right? And you love them, so if you see something shows up, of course you'll have concerns, but it's not your responsibility to manage it when they're young adults. I talk with parents about not sending the first thing that comes to your mind. Avoiding the back and forth. I love it when parents say, here's how I'm inclined to respond. Here's what my old response, the old Brad is, but here's how I'm going to respond because I'm trying to be different in this relationship. Learning when to confront, answer, ignore, understate, chat, share personal anecdotes, right? That's knowing yourself, knowing your truth, knowing your relationship with yourself, knowing your relationship with the other, and knowing your relationship to their problem. You become more clear, asking your intention. When is it too late? When to forgive and move on in relationships? I always talk about too early or too late of an intervention. We all know when it's too. We all can imagine what happens when it's too early. The person doesn't think it's relevant. They might not get as much out of it. But when it's too late, right, if we're going to err on one side or the other, we would err on the side of too early versus too late, because too late is the worst possible outcome. And then we don't get stuck in the power struggle. We learn our boundaries, we learn what we're in charge of and what we're not, and we learn to forgive. I'm going to talk about harm reduction. I took this from harmreduction.org. This is a model out there that basically says that people that are looking like substance abuse disordered people can learn to practice reduction. Some people that are in recovery with the 12 steps don't believe in that. They haven't found it in their own experience, both their personal experience or working with others. So there's debate on that. But I'm going to present it to you because it is one approach and one model. And for some people this works. And for some people it doesn't. And it's important for you to learn which one of those you are. Okay? And I think when people get so polarized and say, this doesn't make, these people say the 12 steps are nonsense and a cult, and the person is limiting their progress and insulting themselves by calling themselves an addict. And then the 12 steppers are looking back at these people and saying, you're dangerous, you're threatening people, you're threatening their well-being. The idea is, if it works for you, it works for you. If it doesn't, then you know you need something else. So I'm just going to read these bullet points, make comments as I go. Harm reduction accepts, for better and for worse, that illicit and illicit drug use is part of our world and chooses to work toward minimizing the harmful effects rather than simply ignoring or condemning them. Okay? Understands that drug use is complex, multifaceted. It's a multifaceted phenomenon that encompasses a continuum of behaviors from severe abuse to total abstinence, and acknowledges that some ways of using drugs are clearly safer than others. Establishes quality of individual and community life and well-being, not necessarily cessation of all drug use, as the criteria for successful interventions and policy. So you can you can learn a new way of thinking. Calls for the non-judgmental, non-coercive provision of services and resources of people who use drugs and the communities in which they live in order to assist them in reducing attendant harm. And again, you can hear this. You can imagine where some of this could be present in all kinds of approaches, including 12 step. Ensures that drug users and those with a history of drug use routinely have a real voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. Makes sense? Affirms drug users themselves as the primary agents of reducing the harms of their drug use, and seeks to empower users to share information and support each other in the strategies that meet their actual conditions of use. Again, that would not be exclusive of 12 steps, although these people might say that it is. Recognizes that the realities of poverty, class, racism, social isolation, past trauma, sex-based discrimination, and other social inequalities, affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related harm. Right? Look at the whole person. Recognize that there's a question here that I'll just mention right now. How do different mental health components complicate recovery? My son suffers borderline and addictions. Suffers from borderline personality disorder and addiction. Seems an impossible task. It absolutely is more challenging. Most addicts have some comorbid mental health issues. Some don't, but most of them do. Most of them have some anxiety, some depression. When you're talking about something more severe like bipolar or borderline, of course it's going to complicate it. And in some ways, you, as a treatment professional, kind of saying, okay, what am I going to work on first? You can do two things at once, so you can walk and chew gum at the same time. But in some cases, there's nothing going to be effective in therapy for the mental health piece if the person's not sober. And another way of thinking, that sometimes if we don't work on some of the mental health issues, like this particular disorder, borderline disorder, then the 12 steps or harm reduction or anything else isn't going to make sense or sink in. So you're just trying to find an entry point. What's my most effective entry point? What is the most eminent threat to this person's safety and well-being? I'm going to try to go there first. I'm going to prioritize it, but not at the full neglect of others. I've seen a lot of people in 12-step meetings where I've thought to myself, I hope they have a therapist. That would be really helpful for them. And then I've seen a lot of therapists in the clinical world who don't understand what it's like for an addict who won't be successful at any of these other models except for something like a 12-step program. So this second to last bullet point on the harm reduction model recognizes the vulnerabilities in the whole person. Does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and dangers associated with illicit and illicit drug use. That makes, of course, perfect sense. Refuge recovery is more recent, and it's based on Buddhist principles, and a lot of our clients gravitate toward that. They find the spiritual component of it very healing. Sometimes I know there are programs out there that are strong 12-step based programs who bring in a lot of these refuge recovery based principles. In fact, I'm doing one at a principally 12-step program later this summer, being invited as a guest speaker, and I'm co-presenting the entire weekend with a Buddhist monk because of the contribution of mindfulness, radical acceptance, meditation, and other practices. So I'll read a couple of quotes that I took from their website, different places. Refuge Recovery is a mindfulness-based addiction recovery community that practices and utilizes Buddhist philosophies as the foundation of the recovery process. Drawing on the inspiration from the core teachings of the Four Noble Truths, emphasis is placed on both knowledge and empathy as a means of overcoming addiction and its causes. Those struggling with any form of addiction greatly benefit when they are able to understand the suffering that addiction has created while developing compassion for the pain they have experienced. We hope to serve you and meet you on the path. Isn't that just beautiful? Can't you see how all of these models have something significantly helpful to contribute? And they go on to say, we combine Buddhist meditation practices with evidence-based psychotherapy models that have been shown to be effective with addiction by offering individuals a full range of therapeutic skills that empower and promote long-term recovery and well-being. We provide research-based programming such as mindfulness-based relapse prevention, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, which is a trauma-based therapy, somatic experiencing, which is also trauma-based, attachment theory, internal family systems, yoga, motivational interviewing, and mindfulness-based living skills. So again, great programs, great programming takes wisdom from anywhere that it can get it and uses it to complement. I think people that develop the theories, and sometimes addicts and codependents are prone to black and white thinking, to being rigid, to being in a power struggle, to having to be right. So you can see where they might present some of these things in a very rigid way. When you develop a theory, one of the things you learn about people that develop new theories in anything, they become very rigid, right? It's only this thing. This is the thing that works. But as we grow and we broaden and we see the middle path, the middle ground, the gray area, people that are in the 12-step recovery will say, whatever your program looks like to you, whatever works for you. People that, of course, are spiritually less capable and flexible in that will say, everything has to be this way. And every version of recovery needs to look like my version of recovery, which is the right way to do it. But that's the way that an addict thinks. So you get that. But this is much more balanced. There's also some smart recovery. Teaches self-empowerment and self-reliance, provides meetings that are educational, supportive, and include open discussions, encourages individuals to recover from addiction and alcohol abuse and live satisfying lives, teaches techniques for self-directed change, supports the scientifically informed use of psychological treatments and legally prescribed psychiatric and addiction medication. So Suboxone would be something that would be supported by this model. Works on substance abuse, alcohol abuse, addiction, and drug abuse as complex maladaptive behaviors with possible physiological factors. Evolves as scientific knowledge and addiction and recovery evolve. This appeals to people who really struggle with the spiritual components of 12 steps, for example. And again, if this can work for you, more power to you. And I think there's a lot in this that's reactive against the 12 step. You see this self-directed language. They're fighting against the idea, I think, the misunderstanding, but the idea of surrender, the idea of I'm powerless over something. Or that they think that idea that I'm powerless over it means that I don't have choice in it, right? They seek to empower. So some of this language is in reaction to that. So those are some of the models. I think the take home is whatever works, right? And so if something doesn't work and you need something more, then you move in that direction. But it also positions us as codependents, us as co-participants in our child's recovery in a place to say, what is our business and what is not our business, right? Where do we stand? Because our work is to apply this to our own recovery as codependents. To our first step is that we realize that we are powerless over other people, and that our lives have become unmanageable. That's our first step, being the loved ones of people who are practicing self-sabotaging or addictive behaviors. Another thing that I'll just say, because I get asked this all the time, I got asked this week. It doesn't have to be an addiction, a drug. It can be anything self-defeating or self-sabotaging. Being in a relationship with somebody who is living in such a way that they're harming themselves, that they're not successful, that they're stuck, that they're in negative patterns, still we can engage in codependency, and we can learn to get out of it through our own work. How do the different mental health components complicate recovery? I already answered that question. Are there any other questions? All right, I'm going to go to the upcoming slides, and then if there are any questions, I'll answer those. We ask all families to try at least 6 12-step support groups. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, or Alateen is for teenagers, siblings. You can also, in addition to this request, go to NAMI.org, the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and you can get classes, free resources in your community. Follow us on social media. All of the webinars are available on podcasts. We usually download them within 24 hours, sometimes a lot quicker than that. So you can listen to them on the go. You can listen into the car while you're exercising, on the train. If you download them before you travel, you don't have to have internet connectivity. If you have an iPod, an iOS device, you can find it by searching on the podcast app, Evoke Therapy Programs. If you have an Android device, you download the SoundCloud app, and you also search Evoke Therapy Programs there. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, Evoke Therapy Programs. If you go to the Second Nature Alumni Foundation on Facebook, you can learn about an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. Of course, going to our blog can be helpful. My book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, is available on Kindle, or actually through iBooks. You can also get it, or you can get an audio version of it, or a printed copy of it, softback. The Parent Alumni Foundation book page is a place you can go on Amazon. You can buy books that are recommended by our therapists on different topics, and a percentage of the proceeds go to charity. So there's no additional cost. So if you're going to buy some of the books that we talk about, including my book, go to that page, buy it through the Amazon Smiles program, and a percentage of the proceeds go to therapy. I don't have any dates yet. I'll be announcing those soon. We want all current parents to go to a workshop. These are multi-family workshops, experiential, staff are present. They're fantastic resources in psychoeducation and experiential therapy for families to go to. You can combine that with a field visit. If your therapist thinks that the timing is right, you can combine that. We have one coming up at Entrada at the end of July and one in August at Cascades. If you want to attend an individual deeper workshop, these are the ones that I run that have psychodrama, mindfulness training, 3-night, 4-day workshops. Finding You is for individuals, and then Finding Family is for families. You can design a custom one. We can design a custom one for you. I will be in Toronto in August. That one is filling up, so is the July one. So if you're interested in that, go to our website. You can also email intensives@evoketherapy.com to find more information. Our pursuits trips are for young adults or families. Think of it as sober fun or therapy light. Any activity, fly fishing, mountain biking, canyoneering, river rafting, anything can be combined with any level of therapy that you would like. All right, last questions. At what point does staying connected versus intervention and therefore imposing our will from the top from one to the other? Our son does not feel it as a problem, but clearly he does. He's 22 years old. It's a really great question. A really great question. It's difficult to answer in a webinar because I would answer it in dialogue with you. And look at the one of the things that you're speaking to. I don't know if you're specifically thinking of this, but look at the Google Rat Park and attachment, Rat Park and attachment and addiction. Rat Park, like R-A-T, Rat Park, addiction and attachment. And look at the TED Talk that has millions and millions of views, where they talk about rats and that live in a park and how important attachment is. I think there's a way to do it. I think there's a way. See, for the codependent, for the person getting into their own recovery, the conversation is, I can't do this anymore, whatever this is. I can't participate in the relationship in this old way. And I'm inviting you to help. These are my boundaries for self-care. That's what the limits are about. So there has to be some growth in the individual who's setting those kind of limits. So hire an interventionist if you need an interventionist, right? Work with a therapist who knows about intervention, because they can talk to you about the setting of boundary, but not in the simple perspective of imposing your will on somebody. And I love your question, because I think it speaks to the challenge, the confusion that we have about intervention. You can read the book Love First by J&J. It's a fantastic book that talks about where intervention comes from, how to do it. But doing it from a power position or simply a leverage position is typically ineffective, at least in the long run. So the boundaries, that I'm done with participating in the relationship in this way, set up a dialogue, set up an openness, set you up to be a resource to them. So it's a difficult question to ask. It's a great question. It's difficult to ask because it would be about talking to you about one or the other and where it comes from, right? And that only happens in dialogue, only happens in therapy. It's about self-awareness. Can you talk a bit about the Al-Anon program and others that are there for the family? Why do we have to go to them if we do not have the problem? Wonderful question. You have a problem. You don't have the problem, first of all. And there is a co-participation. And frankly, it's for your self-care. To love somebody that's suffering from a significant mental health or addiction issue is taxing. And unless you take care of yourself and learn to, and these programs help you to do it, you're going to suffer greatly, and you're not going to be helpful to them. So even if it's not about cause and effect, and it's really not, It's about how to take care of you and how to be in relationship with people who are suffering. For myself, I'm in relationship to dozens of people because I have clients. And so my own personal work around my own personal codependency is I need it to be healthy. And the people that get involved in Al-Anon, they learn that, yeah, they don't have the problem. They don't have the identified patients problem like I talked about in Tuesday's webinar. That's the webinar I did Tuesday. They don't have that problem, but they have issues. They have communication issues. They have boundaries issues. They tend to be over-involved, over-invested. They try to control things. They have anxiety. They beat themselves up. They have a lot of shame. But those are the issues that we have. And the more work we do, the more we realize, the more we can see them. And then the more we can extricate ourselves from those issues and from the dynamics that come out of that. So it's just a healthy way to participate in the life, your life, with somebody who's struggling with some of these issues. Thank you for the question. All right, that was the last question. All right, folks, thank you very much for your participation and for your attendance and for your questions. The next webinar will be, this is a good one. This is one of my favorite ones to do. So talk to your families, your friends, the siblings, anybody. So on Monday, I'm going to do a Q&A, a live Q&A. We'll have some, you can send in questions in advance. You can have questions about family members in addition to having them come from family members. But this is a webinar that I create to be able to talk to you, those that you love, about what we do at Evoke and about our approach. And they can ask tough questions and critical questions, any kind of questions. If you have any doubters or anybody that gives you a hard time about what you've been doing or what you're involved in, you can invite them to this, send them the link, encourage them to come. We'd love to have them. And these are usually some of my most enjoyable webinars because I love addressing people's questions. All right, folks, thank you for joining us tonight. I hope these webinars are a point of helpful contact for you. Again, I hope that the long run mission of these is to have enough dialogue with you to teach you a new way of thinking about yourself, about your child, and about mental health and addiction. So I hope it's helpful to that end. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you on Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.